but I'm going to let Phil be our cue as to when we get started again. But otherwise, just socialize amongst yourselves in the time being. Yeah, you could just talk to yourself. Yeah, that's right. You just talk to yourself, you know. Yeah. Yeah, I heard that the feed broke down last week, so yeah. So better off to just do what we got to do. No, it never did. I know. Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, these are certainly problems we don't have in normal circumstances. But yes, there is. They're on the back. I'll go get one for you. Yeah. Yeah. Oh. We'll be fine without oh, and you got one. Thank you. Okay. Okay, well, we're gonna get back rock and rolling. Okay, so Daniel 2, statue, 4 different parts, and then ultimately that statue is destroyed by a stone cut out without hands, and Daniel will point out that stone turns into a mountain, which will be a kingdom that will never be destroyed. That kingdom is the church that is being prophesied all the way ahead in Daniel. So here's the cool thing about this history. In fact, we could start every class this way if we wanted to, which is, why does it matter? What is the value, and why does it matter that we know what happened to 4 kingdoms that are all gone now anyways? Because history repeats itself. Yeah? What? It validates the word. That's one of my favorite ones, is you start looking at history and here's the prophecy, right? And it came to be. So, yeah. Anything else? Yep, we can learn from that as well. Another one I might add to it is just, I find it just generally encouraging when I realize how much detail God has put in to bringing about the church, and realizing over all the ages, all the little things that had to come together for us to be here doing what we're doing right now. Yep. Yeah, and so you have this overarching just truth of kingdoms come and go, but not God's kingdom. And so, yeah, so Daniel 2, that's going to be the overall vision. Now, it comes up again in Daniel 7, and as I've mentioned before with our Daniel class here, we're not going verse by verse, nor even chapter by chapter. We're going to kind of combine some of the things of Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 together, because in Daniel chapter 7, Daniel will have a vision of 4 different beasts that represent those same 4 kingdoms. So these 2 visions, the one of the statue with the 4 parts and the 4 different beasts, they mesh together. Now those 4 kingdoms are Babylon, MEDO-PERSIA, Greece, and Rome. And so when we look at the parts of the statue, you start with a head of gold, then you go to the chest of silver, then the belly and thighs of bronze, and then the legs, feet of iron, and then by the time you get down to the feet are both iron mixed with clay. So as you look at the different materials from head down, several things begin to stand out really quickly. As you look at gold, silver, bronze, iron and clay, what's one pattern that stands out? Yeah, value worth. Okay, so one simple one is that gold's worth a whole lot more than iron. What's another pattern that stands out? Rarity. Yep. So you have value, rarity, hardness of the metal. That's another thing to look at the list. Iron, much cheaper than gold, right? But you wouldn't want to try and make a crowbar out of gold. It wouldn't be very useful. So you end up with materials that get consecutively harder, but also of lower value. And you also are looking at a chronological list as you go from head to toe. This is the order in time that these nations will be. Babylon is the one that is current during the days of Daniel, right? So Daniel is is explaining this prophecy to Nebuchadnezzar, who is king of Babylon. Rome is a very long time period away still. So you're looking at a chronological list. So as we look at the history of these particular nations, what I want to do tonight is just give you a history lesson, a little bit of how this actually played out. Because here you have Daniel saying this is the way it's going to be. But as was mentioned, it did actually turn out that way. And that validates the Word of God. Because we have an awareness through archaeology and history of how these nations came to be and how they came to fall. We also have an awareness of when Daniel made the prophecy, so you can kind of put the two and two together and say, well, look, Daniel made this prophecy, and then hundreds of years go by before it really begins to fall into place. And they're very specific, some of the details, so it really does validate the Word of God. So as we look at it, let's start with Babylon. Babylon is the head of gold, and in the Daniel 7 vision, it's the winged lion. So it's a lion who is described as also having the wings of an eagle. Today, when you talk about the lion and the eagle, what kind of creatures are you talking about? Yeah, majestic, right? They're predators, and they're also kind of, it's not the lion and the vulture, right? Or the lion and the turkey. These are majestic creatures. And that picture that I have up there is actually from a processional road in Babylon. They gathered all the stones up at a certain point and recreated them in a museum, painstakingly putting everything back in detail. But that processional road in Babylon, it had one after another in order lions. So Babylon associated itself with lions. So when you have this vision of the winged lion, you're not only talking about a majestic kind of vision, but you're also talking about something that would have made sense to Babylonian people hearing this. They were like, yeah, we're lion people. Like, we have that all over in our architecture. It was associated with their culture. And so as we look at the history of Babylon, higher quality pagan kingdom, which sounds like a little bit of an oxymoron to say they're a high quality pagan kingdom. But a couple of things to keep in mind. Nebuchadnezzar, for all of the bad things about him, when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fiery furnace, what did Nebuchadnezzar do? He acknowledged. That's right. He acknowledged and said, everybody stop worshiping this image and start worshiping their God. So he had a level of being willing to go, okay, this is the one true God. As well as the fact that he had enough awareness to elevate those kinds of men into positions of leadership, right? Daniel, who was a ethical, incorruptible, unbribable sort of guy, we can all think, a lot of times those guys never make it, right? They never make it to the upper echelons of government because You have to be corruptible. You have to be bribable, all those sorts of things. You have to know how to play the game. And yet Daniel will rise in ranks in Babylon, as well as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That speaks to something. Later on, Nebuchadnezzar will have that pride. And what happens to him when he gets so proud that he says, look at this nation that I built? Yeah, essentially he's cursed to wander around like an animal until he comes to his senses, which means at some point, guess what Nebuchadnezzar did? Came to his senses, right? So that's pretty high quality. So in terms of nations, Babylon has a lot going for it that other nations later on won't have. So there is that majesty to them. There is that ethical element to them, that grandness to them that matches that idea of both the eagle and the lion and the head of gold. Babylon will start out not with Nebuchadnezzar, but with his dad, Nabopolassar, and he's going to reign from 626 to 605 BC, so that's 19-year reign. He will begin that by rebelling against the other superpower at the time, which was the empire that destroyed the northern kingdom. Anybody know who that is? Assyria. Yeah, that's right. So he rebels against Assyria after they had been under Assyrian control for about 100 years. Interesting detail about him is he attacked the Assyrian army and rebelled, and the Assyrian army in strength came to stop him. And all the historians agree that if the Assyrian army had gone against Nabopolassar's Babylonian army, Babylon would never have happened. Just would have ceased to exist because the Assyrian army was so much more powerful. But at the exact moment when they were about to go to war, word came from Nineveh that there was a coup going on back there, and the Assyrian army turned around and said, we'll deal with you later. Well, by the time later came, guess what Nabopolassar had done with his army? Now that we're ready. And it was a whole different deal. And I look at that, scriptures never specifically address that. But whenever you see something happening at just the right time and just the right way in the history books, and then you go and read things like Romans 13, which tells you every ruler who's in charge is there because God put them there, makes you think about it. It's like, why did that timing have to be the way that it was? So he would eventually, I did that math wrong. It's not 19, it's 21 years, isn't it? He would, after 21 years, he's going to die, and he'll be replaced by his son, Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, so Nebuchadnezzar is the guy that we're all most familiar with. He was the longest reigning monarch in Babylonian history. He reigns for 43 years, from 605 BC to 562 BC. If you've heard of the Babylonian Hanging Gardens, supposedly he built those for a Median princess that he married, and did it to please her. And so Nebuchadnezzar really made Babylon what it was. His dad freed them from Assyria, but Nebuchadnezzar really grew the kingdom. Several really interesting things about Nebuchadnezzar that are recorded through history. One is that he was a huge city builder. So, as I mentioned, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Babylon itself was an unbelievable city for its time. It was the kind of place that people said was unconquerable. There on the Euphrates River, there's no way anybody could defeat him. He's recorded with having renovated from the ground up 13 different cities during his reign. I mean, you think about that. To reign for 40 years and then have 13 different cities that you made majestic and fantastic. And that's a lot to do. Other interesting things that history tells us, that particular stele right there, which is just a way of saying a rock that's got engraving on it, is called the Tower of Babel stele. And you can Google this. Please don't do it right now. But you can go home and Google the Tower of Babel stele. And also the Beers cylinders. Beers is B-I-R-S. And these record the fact that Nebuchadnezzar during his reign, knew of a Tower of Babel. Babylon and Babel are the same words in Hebrew. And that it had for a long time been left unfinished, and that he was going to seek to finish it. This is recorded on that stele. Fascinating little bit of history, isn't it? I just look at that and there's some more validation of the biblical picture, because when we think about the Tower of Babel, what do you know about it? Big fancy tower that went unfinished, right? They're trying to finish it, and so Nebuchadnezzar says, I'm going to finish it, which also tells you something about Nebuchadnezzar's mentality, right? He is the guy who is like, they couldn't finish it, I could do it. There were some humility issues there. So that's recorded, like I said, on that stele, as well as recorded on the burr cylinders. In fact, the burr cylinders, I'll read just a little section of it, word for word. He says, the Tower of Babylon I have made and finished. The Tower of Borsippa has been built by a former king. He had completed it to 42 cubits, but he did not finish its head. From the lapse of time, it had become ruined. The rain and wet had penetrated into the brickwork. The casing of burnt brick had bulged out. Merodach, my great lord, that was the god of Babylon, Merodach, inclined my heart to repair the building. I did not change its site, nor did I destroy its foundation platform, but in a fortunate month and upon an auspicious day, I undertook the rebuilding. I set my hand to build it up and to finish its summit as it had been in ancient times, so I built up its structure. Fascinating little bit. And when you go and later on Google the Tower of Babel stele, you'll see there's a picture of King Nebuchadnezzar, and then it's harder to see on a PowerPoint right now, but there's a tower structure that's kind of been worn away, but there are some enhanced views that will show you that. Another really interesting thing about Nebuchadnezzar that I think we can find from history is what are called Nebuchadnezzar bricks. So this is just one of many, many, many Nebuchadnezzar bricks. And all it really says on the Nebuchadnezzar brick is it just says this brick was made by Nebuchadnezzar, and it refers to him as the eldest son of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon, and so it's just embossed on the brick. History tells us that he made between 14 and 15 million bricks during his reign. What does it take to make a brick? You need mud and you need clay. Yeah, you need clay and then heat. Yeah, where are you going to get that heat from? You're going to get it from a furnace. Anybody know any stories about Nebuchadnezzar and any furnaces? Fascinating, right? When Nebuchadnezzar said, stoke that thing up, that was an industrial grade furnace. And when they got that thing so hot that the guards that threw them in died, this is historically in matches. Just a fascinating sort of detail about the history of Babylon that we can look at. So after Nebuchadnezzar, the next two rulers are a father and a son, Nabonidus and Belshazzar. And so Belshazzar will be the one that you're more familiar with from the biblical record. And Nabonidus was, he was the dad and technically in charge, but once he took power by assassinating Nebuchadnezzar's heir, he left and just basically moved to another part of the kingdom and said, I'm going to go live the good life. My guess is, from what I have read, a lot of that had to do with the fact that when you assassinate the heir, there's people who kind of want to get you back. And so he just kind of said, I'll go over here. And left his son, Belshazzar, to reign in his place. Nabonidus, as well as Belshazzar, were not liked by the people, history records for us, and especially they were not liked by the priestly class. Now, we're not talking about God's priesthood, we're talking about Merodach's priesthood, the Babylonian false gods. And so Belshazzar was often in conflict with them. And so when you look at the recording of Belshazzar and the sorts of things that he was doing that we know of from his short reign, that kind of matches that, right? Is he's having a feast and he's taking things that should belong in to the priest class, which they stole from the temple, and they're now having a feast. So that sort of thing matches. Another interesting thing that it matches is when you get to Daniel chapter 5, and it talks about Belshazzar there, it will then also talk about Daniel, and it will say that Daniel had risen to be the third most powerful man in the kingdom. If you've ever wondered about that, it's like, well, why is he the third most powerful? Well, during this time period, the most powerful is Nabonidus. The second most powerful is his son, and then the third most powerful becomes Daniel. It's another really interesting fact there that matches historically what the Bible teaches. Anybody have any comments or questions on that? I want to make sure I'm not missing anything, or anybody has a question about some of that history there. Okay. Well then yes, John. Yes, Merodach and Marduk are the same. That's, yeah, good, because I think it's referred to one way in some parts of the Old Testament and another way in others. So yes, those names are interchangeable. Yes. Any other questions or comments or anything? Okay, then the next one after Babylon is, that's the Nabonidus cylinder. I forgot to even show that one. That cylinder right there is one that confirms the historical account of Nabonidus and his son Belshazzar also being ruler at the same time. There was a section of time where people thought Belshazzar was a fake, like he wasn't a real historical figure. Then they found this Nabonidus cylinder, and it turns out the Bible was right. You will find that your whole life, by the way. They're always bringing up something. They're like, this can't be accurate. And then they keep digging and they'll find something that is. Okay, the next group is the Medes and the Persians. Sometimes referred to as the MEDO-PERSIan Empire. Sometimes referred to as the Achaemenides Empire, for obvious reasons. I'm not saying that word again. They are the chest of silver, chest and arms of silver, as well as in the Daniel 7 vision, they are the bear. They're described in that vision as a bear, and a lopsided bear, so it's kind of higher on one side with ribs in its mouth. You are moving from a more majestic, in the case of the lion and the eagle. So when you think about a bear with ribs in its mouth, what are you talking about now? Aggressive, strength, exactly. Yeah, you're looking at power. And that is exactly what the Medo-Persian Empire was. It was a bigger empire than the Babylonian one, not necessarily higher quality. Turns out quantity and quality, not the same thing. It was led by a guy by the name of Cyrus the Great. History refers to him as Cyrus the Great. You know you have made it when the history books call you the Great. There's actually not very many that fit that category, but Cyrus is one of them. He's going to rule from 550 to 530 BC, so a reign of 20 years. Fascinating thing about him is he is one of the few rulers that is mentioned by name in the Old Testament. And God called ahead of time through Isaiah. He says, I am going to raise up a guy by the name of Cyrus, and he will be my shepherd and my anointed. In fact, we can go over to the book of Isaiah and look at some of the things that are said there. In Isaiah 44, we'll start in about verse 23. I'm not going to read everything, but just kind of hop around a little bit here. 44 verse 23, shout for joy, O heavens, for the Lord has done it. So there's this great speech about how God's done it. And he says, for the Lord has redeemed Jacob. So this whole passage is about how God is going to do that, redeem them. And then you go down to verse 28. It says, "It is I who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he will perform all my desire. And he declares of Jerusalem, she will be built, and of the temple, your foundation will be laid." So back in the days of Isaiah, before they'd even gone into captivity, God says, I'm going to raise up a guy by the name of Cyrus. He's going to bring you back from captivity, and he's going to let you rebuild the city and rebuild the temple. Well, that is exactly what will happen. The other thing that I think is interesting that is mentioned in Isaiah 45, down in verse 4, is he says, "For the sake of Jacob, my servant, and Israel, my chosen one, I've also called you by your name." Speaking of Cyrus, I've called you by your name. "I've given you a title of honor," Cyrus the Great, "though you have not known me." It doesn't say that Cyrus will be a follower of Jehovah. In fact, it says the exact opposite. He won't follow God. But God will call him my shepherd and my anointed. In other words, I've picked you, and I'm going to use you, and you're going to get done the stuff I want to get done. And it doesn't matter that you don't know me. I know you, and I'm the one who gave you your title of honor. I love that about Cyrus, because the implications of that are huge, aren't they? Does it matter if the president believes in God? For his soul it does, but for you and I, not one whit. We don't have to worry about that stuff. It's just not our problem. And history plays out that that is exactly what happened. They did become a great nation after Babylon, which, by the way, everybody, when Babylon was around, they had the mentality of Nebuchadnezzar, which is, look at what a great and powerful nation, nothing will ever be bigger than it. Well, guess what happens after the Medes and the Persians? The Medo-Persian Empire becomes even bigger. And so Daniel 7, in that vision of the bear, he says, "Arise and devour much meat." They are a hungry nation. They grow the borders and the boundaries. And so they become a pretty impressive thing. This picture here is of Cyrus's tomb, which is still here today. You can go and visit it. Turns out being Cyrus the Great does not save you from dying. Something to remember, right? Doesn't matter what sort of title of honor you get, you will eat dirt like everybody else. So you better make sure you're right with your God. The other thing that's interesting is history records that Cyrus did exactly what we find was prophesied and the Bible records happening, which is Cyrus got to be in charge. And I'll talk a little bit about how that happened too, because that's an interesting bit. And the Cyrus cylinder says that when he became in charge, he wanted to be loved by the religious classes. Because if you remember, Nabonidus and Belshazzar were not. So he wanted that to curry that favor with all the different religious groups. And so when he entered Babylon, the Cyrus cylinder records that what he did is he says, "I returned the images of the gods who had resided there to their places, and I let them dwell in eternal abodes. I gathered all their inhabitants and returned them to their dwellings." The Cyrus cylinder describes that he let all the people of different religious wanted to go back to their home countries and rebuild and worship their gods. They could do that, which is exactly what God has said would happen, and it's exactly what the book of Ezra describes happened historically. And for ages, historians said, no emperor would ever do that. Why would he ever do something crazy like that? Until they found the Cyrus cylinder, and sure enough, that's exactly what he did. So once again, the Bible is validated and accurate. The other interesting thing is when Cyrus came in and conquered Babylon, remember that unconquerable city that everybody said you could never conquer it? Guess how many people died in that battle? None. Nobody died. Cyrus walked up to the city gates and they let him in. Because that religious group that hated Nabonidus and Belshazzar told all the people, this guy will treat us nice. And they just opened the doors and he was king. "I shall call you my shepherd and my anointed, and I will give you a title of honor, even though you don't know me." This is how God works. He does wild stuff. And he does it all the time. For those of you who remember the Berlin Wall coming down, how did you feel when it happened? It was unbelievable that it just occurred. Just like one day, some dude walks up, starts chipping away at the thing, and nobody kills him. And then more and more people, and then one day, and it's just gone. Stuff like that happens because God's in control, and he can do whatever he wants, whenever he wants. And so the history of all of this just really lays out those sorts of details. Anybody have any questions about the Medo-Persian Empire at all? Yeah. Uh-huh. Correct. Correct. He reigned over the Medo-Persian Empire, and they did not conquer Babylon until 539. So, yeah, good question. Yeah, so there's some overlap in the dates between the reign of Cyrus and the dates of the reign of Nabonidus and Belshazzar, because there was a time where Cyrus is over here, he's in charge of the Medo-Persian Empire, but he's not yet conquered Babylon. So at 539, that's when they swung open the gates of Babylon, let them in, and there was the changing of the guard. Any other questions or comments? Okay, so third one is Greece. I tried to find a cool picture of a four-headed, four-winged leopard, and they all look stupid. So you just get a normal leopard. So that, just so you know. Technically, the vision is you have in the statue, it's the belly and the thighs of bronze, and then in Daniel 7's vision, it's of a leopard that has 4 sets of wings and then 4 heads. I like to describe the leopard that is Greece as the bullet train, the leopard with a jetpack. It is fast. It is not as powerful as a bear, right? Nor as majestic as a lion or an eagle, but it's quick. And so that is the picture of how Alexander the Great would eventually spread. And we'll talk about why there are 4 heads to that leopard as well. So Greece, when it began with power, it started with Alexander the Great's dad, Philip II. He was 24 years old when he began to reign. And Greece is from the Macedonia region. So in the New Testament, you can kind of make some connections there of the vision of the Macedonian man and Philippi. You think about Philip II. What might they call a city Philippi? You know, those sorts of connections, right? So he started reigning, and he didn't really grow the nation. He didn't get very far with growing it, but he did a really good job of mobilizing and uniting all of the various districts of Macedonia, so that they were all busy fighting with each other previously, but now he said, why don't we just agree with each other and go fight other people? And they all seemed to think that was a pretty good idea. So he did some things that were totally new. One of those was his organization of the military. Everybody got the same equipment. Novel idea, right? You look at the U.S. military now, and the idea of having standardized uniforms or standardized gear or kits, that all started back here. And it worked. Turns out if everybody has the same weapons and the same gear, you can train them the same way and they become a mobilized unit. And other people did it better than him. Rome will do it better than him, but he was kind of the first guy to really get that thing squared away. Eventually he was assassinated by his bodyguard. There is some irony to that. And his son Alexander the Great began to reign. He was king at 20 years old. And he won every battle that he personally commanded. Every time that guy went to war, he won. History records him as the Great because that was the title that he gave himself. He wanted to be Alexander the Great. He was well known for his ego. he believed that he was a deity. That was also kind of a new thing, this idea of a guy saying, everybody has to worship me. Alexander was, I can't say he was the first guy to do it, but he certainly paved the way for the Caesars later on, who would do the same sort of thing. Very controlling. From first battle to the last battle, it took him about 8 years to conquer the known world. 8 years, and he conquered the whole thing. Leopard with a jetpack. He had 4 generals. He would die. Basically, it was, after he got done fighting, his life imploded pretty quickly. He had 4 generals: Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy the First. We refer to Ptolemy the First because there's going to be a whole lot of other Ptolemies after him. But it is likely those 4 generals that 4-headed leopard is referring to, because after Alexander the Great was gone, those 4 guys will fight over the kingdom and split it up and divvy it amongst themselves for quite a long time. So that is the story of Greece. Any comments or questions? Yes. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Yes. Yeah, they are. So, okay. So I have a shortage of time, but there's a really cool story I have about a snow leopard that tried to kill me once. It didn't work. But yes, they are surplus killers. They will kill for fun. They're cats, right? They play with their food. So it is. It really is. It's a very fitting vision for him. He liked conquering, and it was really all he was good at. Once he ran out of conquering, his life just totally imploded. And there's some question exactly about how he died, but it wasn't making good life choices. Let's put it that way. Okay, so the fourth one, I'm going to go through this one fairly quickly, is the Roman Empire, and it is referred to as the legs of feet of iron and clay. And then in the beast vision, it's just referred to as the dreadful beast that is unlike the others. It is a nasty, powerful thing. That iron really comes into play. Before it was an empire, it was a republic, and it grew, and that's where if you heard about the Roman Senate, and then Julius Caesar, and Et tu, Brute, and all that kind of stuff, eventually the corruption in that republic reached a point to where Julius Caesar, who was part of a triumvirate, 3 powerful guys who would share power, finally rose up and said, I'm going to take power, and we're not going to be a republic anymore. We're going to follow an emperor. And that's, if you've ever heard the phrase crossing the Rubicon, that's where that's from. It's from Julius Caesar crossing over the Rubicon River. And the moment he did that, that's a declaration of war, that he was going to take power. But the first official one is Augustus. His given name is Gaius Octavius. And he began, once Augustus was in charge, he began a reign of about 200 years of Pax Romana, or Roman peace. It is during that 200 years of peace that a common language, safe roads, justice, economic prosperity, a strong military presence all came into being in the Roman world. And it is that world, with a common language and safe roads to travel on, that God sent His Son. And the message of Jesus spread across those Pax Romana roads, and the world was never the same. And it is an interesting thing. The vision ends with saying that stone that is cut out without hands, that divine stone, would destroy that statue. The statue would go away, but it would turn into a great mountain. Right now, we're sitting here talking about the history of those kingdoms, while we are living the history of the church. It all came true. But if you had been a betting man and said, who wins, Rome or a bunch of people from the city of Jerusalem who have been told if somebody beats you on the cheek, you give them the other one also? Who wins that battle? You would think so. You'd think Rome would win every time, but you'd be wrong, because Rome didn't have God with them. The church did. I know that I am at time at this point. Does anybody have any questions or comments or anything like that before we shut down? Okay. Phil, I think, is going to lead us in a closing prayer and as well as any announcements we might have.